Dr. Michael Henderson's stethoscope slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering against the sterile hospital floor as he stared at his father's exposed back. The metal hit linoleum with a sharp ring that seemed to echo through the sudden, suffocating silence. What he saw wasn't the simple age spots or surgical scars he'd expected. Nurse Betty Sullivan gasped audibly behind him, her clipboard tumbling from her hands as she stepped backward into the doorway. The young resident beside her went pale, fumbling for his phone with shaking hands. Even the seasoned charge nurse, who'd seen everything in 30 years, covered her mouth in stunned disbelief. Michael's mind raced back to every missed dinner, every declined invitation, every time his 78-year-old father had refused to remove his shirt, even in sweltering Ohio summers. The proud Korean War veteran who'd raised him had been hiding this landscape of secrets beneath pressed cotton and stubborn silence. "Dear God, Dad," Michael whispered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "What happened to you?" How long had Robert Henderson carried these wounds alone? And why had a decorated war hero spent 30 years hiding from the very son who dedicated his life to healing others? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Robert "Bobby" Henderson had been living the same routine he'd maintained since his beloved Martha passed 2 years ago. Every morning at 5 a.m. sharp, the 78-year-old veteran would shuffle to his kitchen in the modest 2-story house on Maple Street, brew his black coffee in the same chipped mug Martha had given him for their 25th anniversary, and sit at the worn Formica table where they'd shared breakfast for nearly 5 decades. The house in Millbrook, Ohio, population 3,200, remained exactly as Martha had left it. Her reading glasses still perched on the kitchen counter next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. Her romance novels lined the shelves in perfect alphabetical order, bookmarks still tucked between pages she'd never finish. Robert couldn't bring himself to move a single item. "It's like she just stepped out for groceries," he'd mutter to himself, though the neighbors knew better than to comment on his grief. After coffee, Robert would perform his daily flag ceremony in the front yard, raising the American colors with military precision while the town slowly awakened around him. Mrs. Peterson from next door often watched from her window, noting how the old soldier's hands never shook, how his back remained ramrod straight despite his age. What she couldn't see were the careful movements he made to avoid stretching certain muscles, the way he favored his left side, or how he'd pause sometimes, hand pressed against his ribs, waiting for waves of pain to pass. Dr. Michael Henderson, Robert's son, called from Chicago every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. sharp. These conversations followed the same pattern. Weather reports, updates on Michael's cardiology practice, polite inquiries about Robert's health that were always deflected with a gruff, "I'm fine, son." "Quit worrying about your old man." Michael had been trying for months to convince his father to move closer, maybe into one of those nice senior communities near the hospital where he worked. "Dad, at your age, you shouldn't be living alone," Michael would argue during their weekly calls, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that served him well in medical consultations but fell flat with his stubborn father. "Your generation thinks everything needs fixing," Robert would reply, his weathered hands gripping the phone tighter than necessary. "Back in my day, we handled our own problems." What Michael didn't know was that every Wednesday, Robert would disappear for exactly 4 hours. He'd tell the neighbors he was running errands, but his beat-up Ford pickup would head straight out of town toward the interstate. These mysterious trips had been happening for over a decade, yet no one in Millbrook had ever questioned where the quiet war hero went or why he always returned looking somehow both exhausted and peaceful. The townspeople respected Robert Henderson. He'd lived in Millbrook since 1953, married their beloved librarian Martha, and raised a son who became a doctor. But respect came with distance. Robert kept to himself, deflected personal questions, and wore long sleeves even during Ohio's brutal summer heat waves. The November morning started like any other Veterans Day in Millbrook, with crisp air carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of snow. Robert Henderson stood before the town's modest war memorial at precisely 7 a.m., just as he had every November 11th for the past 30 years. The bronze plaque bore the names of 17 local boys who'd never made it home from various conflicts, and Robert knew every single story behind every single name. Mayor Collins had asked him to say a few words at the ceremony, but Robert had declined with his usual gruff politeness. "Let the younger folks do the talking," he'd said. Though at 78, Robert was one of the few remaining Korean War veterans in the county. He preferred to honor the fallen in silence, standing at attention while the high school band played taps with varying degrees of success. This year felt different somehow. As Robert grasped the rope to raise the American flag, his chest tightened with an unfamiliar pressure that had nothing to do with emotion. The flag seemed heavier than usual, the simple act of pulling the rope requiring more effort than it should. He paused halfway through the ceremony, one hand pressed against his ribs, feeling a sharp, stabbing sensation that took his breath away. "Mr. Henderson, you okay there?" called out Jenny Martinez, the young teacher who'd brought her third-grade class to watch the ceremony. Her voice carried genuine concern, but Robert waved her off with practiced stubbornness. "Just need a moment," he managed, though his face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. The children stared with wide eyes as the old soldier swayed slightly on his feet, his grip on the flag rope the only thing keeping him upright. That's when it happened. Robert's knees buckled without warning, sending him crashing to the cold ground beside the memorial. The flag rope slipped from his fingers, and Old Glory dropped to half-mast with an ominous flutter. Jenny Martinez screamed, her students scrambling backward as their teacher fumbled for her cell phone. "Call 911!" shouted Frank Morrison, the hardware store owner, as he rushed to Robert's side. Bobby, can you hear me?" Robert's eyes fluttered open, revealing the fierce blue gaze that had intimidated half the town for decades. Don't need an ambulance," he wheezed, trying to push himself up from the frost-covered grass. "Just help me to my truck." "The hell you don't need help," snapped Morrison, using language he'd never dare employ in front of school children under normal circumstances. "You just collapsed in front of half the town, you stubborn old fool." Within minutes, the wail of sirens filled the crisp morning air. EMT Sarah Beth Tucker, whose own grandfather had served in World War II, knelt beside Robert with professional efficiency. "Mr. Henderson, I need you to stay still while we check you over." "I'm fine," Robert insisted, though his voice lacked its usual commanding authority. "Just got dizzy for a second. Happens to everyone my age." "When's the last time you saw a doctor?" Sarah Beth asked, noting the way Robert favored his left side and how his breathing seemed labored. "Don't need doctors," Robert muttered, his standard response to all medical inquiries. "I've been taking care of myself just fine for 78 years. The crowd that had gathered for the Veterans Day ceremony now formed a worried circle around their fallen neighbor. Mrs. Peterson clutched her purse with white knuckles, remembering all the mornings she'd watched Robert struggle with simple tasks he thought no one could see. Pastor Williams pushed through the crowd, his face grave with concern. "Bobby, your boy Michael needs to know about this," the pastor said gently. "He's a doctor, for heaven's sake. He can help." Something flickered in Robert's eyes at the mention of his son, fear, perhaps, or shame. "Michael's got his own life in Chicago. Don't bother him with this." But Jenny Martinez had already pulled up Michael's contact information from the emergency card Robert had reluctantly filled out for the school district years ago when he'd volunteered to speak about the Korean War. Her fingers shook as she dialed the number, wondering how to tell a son that his father had just collapsed at a patriotic ceremony. The EMTs managed to convince Robert to let them transport him to Millbrook General, though he grumbled and protested the entire way. As the ambulance pulled away from the memorial, its red and blue lights reflecting off the bronze plaque, the townspeople stood in stunned silence. They'd always seen Robert Henderson as invincible, a pillar of quiet strength who'd outlasted 2 wars and buried a beloved wife with stoic dignity. None of them realized they'd just witnessed the moment when 30 years of carefully guarded secrets would finally begin to unravel. Dr. Michael Henderson was 3 hours into a complex cardiac catheterization when his pager buzzed with an urgency that made his surgical team exchange worried glances. Michael never allowed interruptions during procedures. His patients' lives depended on his complete focus. But something about the insistent beeping made him pause, his hands frozen over the monitor displaying his patient's vital signs. "Dr. Rodriguez, can you take over for a moment?" he asked his resident, stepping back from the table with uncharacteristic hesitation. The call was from an Ohio number he didn't recognize, and a cold dread settled in his stomach as he listened to the trembling voice of a woman identifying herself as Jenny Martinez. "Your father collapsed during the Veterans Day ceremony," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He's at Millbrook General Hospital. The EMTs said you should come." Michael's world tilted. His father, the man who'd taught him that weakness was a choice and strength was a duty, had collapsed in public. Robert Henderson, who'd never missed a day of work in 40 years, who'd carried Martha to bed every night during her final illness, who'd raised the flag every morning regardless of weather or health. That man had fallen. "I'll be there in 4 hours," Michael said, already mentally calculating the drive from Chicago to Millbrook. He turned to his team with the practiced efficiency that had made him one of the city's top cardiologists. "Dr. Rodriguez, close for me. Something's wrong with my father." The drive to Ohio passed in a blur of highway lights and mounting anxiety. Michael tried calling the hospital repeatedly, but the staff would only confirm that Robert was stable and comfortable, medical euphemisms that told him absolutely nothing. When had he last seen his father? Easter, maybe? Or was it Christmas? The realization hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't remember the last time they'd been in the same room. Millbrook General Hospital was exactly what Michael expected from a small-town medical facility. Outdated equipment, fluorescent lighting that flickered occasionally, and the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with fear. He found his father in room 214, looking smaller and more fragile than Michael had ever seen him. Robert was awake, staring at the ceiling with the 1,000-yard stare that Michael had noticed in childhood but never understood. The hospital gown hung loose on his frame, revealing arms that seemed thinner than Michael remembered. But it was his father's eyes that stopped Michael cold. They held a wariness that went beyond typical medical anxiety. "Dad?" Michael approached the bed cautiously, noting how Robert's shoulders tensed at his presence. "How are you feeling?" "Told them not to call you," Robert said, his voice carrying the familiar gruff dismissal that had ended so many conversations over the years. "It's nothing serious. Just got a little dizzy." Dr. Patricia Willows, the attending physician, pulled Michael aside with a grave expression that spoke volumes. She was young, probably fresh out of residency, but her eyes held the weary knowledge that came from dealing with stubborn, elderly patients. "Your father is refusing most of our standard tests," she explained, her voice low enough that Robert couldn't overhear. "We managed to get basic blood work and an EKG, but he won't consent to imaging studies. Says he knows his own body and doesn't need pictures to prove he's fine." Michael felt frustration bubble up, the same emotion that had plagued their relationship for decades. That's typical. He's always been impossible about medical care. "What do the tests you did manage to get show?" Some irregularities that concern me, but nothing definitive without further testing. Dr. Henderson, can I ask when your father last had a comprehensive physical exam? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Michael realized with growing horror that he couldn't answer it. Had Robert seen a doctor since Martha's death? Since her illness? The truth was devastating. Michael, a physician who preached preventive care to his patients daily, had no idea about his own father's medical history. I'm not sure, Michael admitted, feeling like the worst son and doctor in the world simultaneously. That evening, as Michael sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair watching his father sleep, Nurse Betty Sullivan knocked softly on the door. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who'd spent decades caring for people who didn't want to be cared for. Dr. Henderson. Could I speak with you privately? In the hallway, Betty's professional composure cracked slightly. Your father, there's something you should know. When we were helping him change into the hospital gown, I noticed. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Well, there are some unusual markings on his back, scars that they don't look like typical surgical scars or accident injuries. Michael's medical training kicked in. What kind of markings? I've been a nurse for 25 years and I've never seen anything quite like them. They're old, very old, but extensive, patterned almost. Dr. Willows wanted to examine them more thoroughly, but your father became extremely agitated when we suggested it. The pieces of a puzzle Michael didn't even know existed began forming in his mind. His father's refusal to remove his shirt even during the hottest summers. The way Robert always wore long sleeves, even to bed, according to Martha's occasional comments. The mysterious Wednesday disappearances that had puzzled the whole town. There's something else, Betty continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. When the Korean War memorial visitor came by this afternoon, Mr. Park, the elderly gentleman from Seoul who visits every Veterans Day, your father spoke to him in what sounded like fluent Korean, not just military phrases, Dr. Henderson, full conversations. Michael stared at her in disbelief. In all his 52 years, he'd never heard his father speak a word of Korean. Robert had always been tight-lipped about his military service, deflecting questions with comments about the past, being the past, and some stories being better left untold. The next morning brought a revelation that would change everything Michael thought he knew about his father. Doctor. Patricia Willows approached him in the hospital cafeteria, clutching a manila folder with the intensity of someone carrying state secrets. Dr. Henderson, we finally managed to access your father's military records, she said, sliding into the plastic chair across from him. What we found is unusual. Michael set down his coffee, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. Unusual how? According to these documents, your father was listed as missing in action for 18 months during the Korean War, from October 1952 to April 1954. The official record states he was captured during a reconnaissance mission near the 38th parallel and held in a prisoner of war camp until a prisoner exchange. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. 18 months as a POW. His father had never mentioned being captured, never spoke of prison camps or torture. In fact, Robert had barely mentioned Korea at all, dismissing Michael's childhood questions with vague comments about doing his duty and serving his country. There's more, Dr. Willows continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. The medical examination he received upon repatriation noted extensive scarring consistent with prolonged physical trauma and recommended ongoing psychological support. There's no record of him ever receiving that support. Michael's mind raced through decades of memories, searching for clues he'd missed. His father's nightmares that Martha had mentioned in passing. The way Robert would sometimes freeze when he heard helicopters overhead. his absolute refusal to watch war movies or discuss military service with other veterans, it all began to make a horrifying kind of sense. "I need to see those scars," Michael said, his voice tight with professional determination and personal anguish. "He's refused every attempt at examination. Yesterday, when Dr. Morrison tried to listen to his lungs from behind, your father became so agitated we had to sedate him. It was like he was reliving something traumatic." That afternoon, Michael found his father staring out the hospital window at the flag in the courtyard below. Robert's hands were folded in his lap, but Michael could see the subtle tremor in his fingers, a detail he'd somehow missed during all their brief, surface-level visits over the years. "Dad, we need to talk about your medical records." Robert's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn around. "Nothing to talk about. That was a long time ago." 18 months as a prisoner of war isn't nothing, Dad. "The doctors need to understand what happened to you so they can help." "Some things don't need helping," Robert said, his voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone that Michael now recognized as a defense mechanism. "Some things are better left alone." Michael moved to stand beside his father at the window. "The nurses said you have scars. Extensive scars. Why didn't you ever tell me?" For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the steady beep of the heart monitor. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You were just a baby when I came home. Martha and I. We decided some stories were too heavy for a child to carry. Then you grew up, became successful, became a doctor who saves lives." Robert's voice cracked slightly. "How could I burden you with stories of what happens when people destroy them?" The revelation hit Michael like a tsunami of understanding and heartbreak. His father hadn't been protecting himself by keeping these secrets, he'd been protecting his son. All those deflected questions, all those changes of subject, all those times Robert had smiled and said, "The past is the past," while clearly carrying wounds that had never healed. "Dad, I'm not a child anymore. I'm a doctor. I've seen trauma. I've treated veterans with PTSD. You don't have to protect me." Robert finally turned from the window, and Michael saw tears in his father's eyes for the first time since Martha's funeral. "Son, you don't understand. What they did. What I had to endure. What I had to do to survive. Those aren't stories a father tells his child. Those are nightmares a father takes to his grave." The conversation was interrupted by Nurse Betty Sullivan, who entered with an elderly Korean man Michael recognized from the memorial ceremony. The visitor's name was Mr. Park, and his presence seemed to transform Robert in ways Michael couldn't understand. "안녕하세요, Henderson 씨," Mr. Park said softly, and Michael watched in amazement as his father's face lit up with recognition and warmth. "Bag SCI, 안녕하십니다," Robert replied fluently, rising from his chair with more energy than he'd shown since his collapse. The two men spoke in rapid Korean for several minutes, while Michael stood transfixed. This wasn't the handful of military phrases any soldier might pick up. This was fluent conversational Korean spoken with obvious comfort and familiarity. When had his father learned to speak Korean so well, and why had he never mentioned this skill? Mr. Park eventually switched to English, his eyes kind but serious as he addressed Michael. "Your father saved my life," he said simply. "In the camp, he shared his food when he had none. He taught me English words to help me survive. When the guards, when they hurt us, he would tell stories to help us forget the pain." Michael felt the room spinning around him. Camp. "What camp?" "Yodok," Robert said quietly, the word falling from his lips like a stone into still water. "Prisoner of war camp, North Korea. 18 months, 2 weeks, 3 days. Your father was a hero to many of us," Mr. Park continued. "He organized escapes, protected the weak, kept our spirits alive when we wanted to die. But the price, he gestured vaguely toward Robert's torso. The price he paid for his leadership was very high. That evening, after Mr. Park had left and the hospital had settled into its nighttime quiet, Michael sat beside his father's bed with 1,000 questions burning in his chest. But he started with the most important one. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell me about this? About what you went through, about what you did for those men?" Robert was quiet for so long that Michael thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of carefully guarded pain. "Michael, you became a doctor because you wanted to heal people. You chose a profession based on hope, on the belief that broken things can be fixed, that lives can be saved." Robert's eyes met his son's in the dim hospital lighting. "How could I tell you that your father survived by watching men die? That I made choices in that camp that no human being should ever have to make?" "What kind of choices?" "The kind that keep you alive when others don't make it home." Robert's voice was barely audible. "The kind that save some lives by sacrificing others. The kind that leave marks on your soul that never heal, no matter how many years pass." Michael reached for his father's hand, noting how Robert flinched slightly at the contact before allowing it. "Dad, you were a prisoner of war. Whatever you did to survive. There's no shame in surviving." "Isn't there?" Robert's voice cracked. "When young Park there tells you I saved his life, he's telling the truth." "But he doesn't know about the others, the ones I couldn't save, the ones I had to choose not to save." The weight of his father's confession settled over Michael like a heavy blanket. Here was a man who'd carried the burden of impossible wartime decisions for over 60 years, who'd built a quiet life in a small town while bearing psychological scars that made his physical wounds seem trivial by comparison. "The Wednesday trips," Michael said suddenly, understanding flooding through him. "Where do you go every Wednesday?" Robert's laugh was bitter. "Veterans Cemetery in Columbus. 3 hours there, 1 hour visiting graves, 3 hours back. 47 names on 47 headstones. Men who didn't make it home because of choices I made." Michael felt tears burning his eyes. All those years of thinking his father was emotionally distant, unavailable, unwilling to connect. In reality, Robert had been drowning in survivor's guilt and trauma, protecting his family from the darkness he carried by keeping it locked away inside himself. "Dad, you need help. Professional help, therapy, medication, whatever it takes to—" "No." The word came out sharp and final. "I've lived with this for 60 years. I can live with it until I die. Some wounds are too old to heal, son. Some stories are too dark to tell. Some men are too broken to fix." But Michael was no longer the distant, busy son who'd accepted his father's emotional walls. He was a doctor, and he'd just discovered that his patient, his father, had been suffering in silence for decades with treatable trauma. The battle for Robert Henderson's healing was about to begin. The confrontation that would define their relationship forever began the next morning when Dr. Patricia Willows delivered news that shattered the fragile peace Michael had begun to feel about his father's condition. "Dr. Henderson, we need to discuss your father's test results," she said, her professional composure barely masking obvious concern. "The blood work shows some irregularities that require immediate attention, and we desperately need to do imaging studies of his torso, but he's absolutely refusing all further testing." Michael found his father sitting rigidly upright in the hospital bed, fully dressed in his own clothes, despite being a patient. Robert's jaw was set in the stubborn line that Michael remembered from childhood arguments, and his eyes held the flat, determined look that meant no amount of reasoning would change his mind. "Dad, you need to let them run the tests. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it." "I'm a doctor. I know what I'm talking about." "And I know my own body," Robert replied with characteristic gruffness. I've been living in it for 78 years. If something was seriously wrong, I'd know. That's not how medicine works, and you know it. Michael's voice rose with frustration born of decades of similar conversations. You can't diagnose yourself, Dad. You're not invincible, despite what you might think. I never said I was invincible. Robert's voice carried an edge that made Michael pause. I said, I know what I can and can't handle. There are things about this body that no test is going to tell you, son. Things that no amount of medical school can prepare you for. Dr. Willows cleared her throat diplomatically. Mr. Henderson, I understand your reluctance, but based on what we can see externally and your symptoms, there's a possibility that old injuries could be affecting your current health. The scarring that's visible suggests trauma that might have caused internal damage. The mention of his scars caused Robert to flinch visibly, his hands instinctively moving to his torso in a protective gesture that spoke volumes about his psychological state. Those scars are old business, he said firmly. They healed a long time ago. Dad, scars don't just affect the skin, Michael interjected, his medical training overriding his emotions. Scar tissue can cause problems decades later. It can restrict organ function, affect circulation, cause pain that gets worse with age. You need to let us examine them properly. No. The word came out like a gunshot, sharp and final. Robert's face had gone pale and Michael could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool hospital air. No one looks at them. No one touches them. That's not negotiable. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Robert's heart monitor, which was registering an elevated pulse that confirmed his agitation. Michael had seen this reaction in trauma patients before. The absolute terror of being examined, the panic that came from feeling vulnerable and exposed. Mr. Henderson, Dr. Willows said gently, can you help us understand why you're so opposed to the examination? Are you in pain? Are you afraid of what we might find? Robert's laugh was bitter and humorless. Lady, you have no idea what real pain looks like. What I'm afraid of is having my private business become everyone else's concern. Some things are meant to stay buried. Michael felt his own frustration boiling over. Your private business? Dad, you collapsed in front of half the town. You're in a hospital because something is seriously wrong, and you're sitting here acting like we're asking you to commit a crime. Maybe because that's what it feels like, Robert snapped, his voice rising for the first time since Michael had arrived. Maybe because those scars represent things that should never have happened to anyone, and I'll be damned if I'm going to put them on display for a bunch of strangers to gawk at. The raw pain in his father's voice stopped Michael cold. This wasn't just stubbornness or pride. This was trauma so deep and unhealed that the thought of exposure created genuine terror. Dad, Michael said more softly, we're not strangers. I'm your son. Dr. Willows is here to help. We're not going to hurt you. That's what they said in the camp, Robert whispered. And suddenly Michael understood that his father wasn't really in the hospital room anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere terrible, reliving horrors that had happened over 60 years ago. Dr. Willows stepped forward with the practiced calm of someone who dealt with trauma patients before. Mr. Henderson, you're safe. You're in Millbrook General Hospital. It's 2024, and you're with your son, Michael. Can you tell me where you are? Robert blinked several times, his eyes gradually focusing on the present. I'm in the hospital. I know where I am. I can't let you see them. You don't understand what they mean. Then help us understand, Michael pleaded. Tell us what happened. Tell us what we need to know to help you. For a moment, Robert seemed to consider it. His hands gripped the bed rails so tightly his knuckles went white, and Michael could see the internal battle playing out across his father's weathered features. They used electricity, Robert said finally, his voice so quiet Michael had to strain to hear him. Not just, not just to hurt us, to mark us. They had a pattern, a design. Said it would help them identify us if we tried to escape again after they caught us the first time. The room seemed to shrink around them as the full horror of his father's words sank in. Michael had read about the torture methods used in North Korean prison camps, but hearing his own father describe being systematically marked like livestock was almost more than he could bear. "The scars aren't random," Robert continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the words he'd never said aloud before. "They're deliberate. They tell a story that no one should have to read. Every mark represents a choice I made, a man I couldn't save, a day I survived when others didn't." Michael felt tears running down his cheeks. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "Of course you had no idea." Robert's voice cracked with emotion he'd kept buried for decades. "That was the point. You were supposed to grow up normal, happy, without carrying the weight of what your father had to endure. You were supposed to be a doctor who saves lives, not a son who has to carry his father's ghosts." Dr. Willows spoke up carefully. "Mr. Henderson, I understand this is incredibly difficult, but those old injuries could be affecting your health now. The electrical burns, the physical trauma, they could be connected to your current symptoms." "What symptoms?" Michael asked, realizing he'd been so focused on the emotional revelations that he'd missed crucial medical information. "Irregular heartbeat, numbness in his extremities, episodes of severe chest pain," Dr. Willows listed. "All consistent with nerve damage from electrical torture. But without proper imaging, we can't determine the extent of the damage or develop an appropriate treatment plan." Robert was shaking his head before she finished speaking. "I've lived with it this long. I can live with it until I die. I won't be put on display like some medical curiosity." "You're not a curiosity, Dad. You're my father and you're sick, and I'm not going to let pride kill you when we can help." "Some things are worse than dying, son," Robert said with quiet dignity. "Some humiliations are worse than death." The standoff continued for hours, with medical staff, Michael, and even Pastor Williams from Robert's church trying to convince the stubborn veteran to accept treatment. But Robert remained unmoved, his trauma-born terror of exposure stronger than his desire to live. It was only when Nurse Betty Sullivan mentioned that Mr. Park had called asking about Robert's condition that something shifted in the old soldier's eyes. "He knows," Robert said quietly. "Park knows what the marks mean. He was there." "Then he would understand why you need treatment," Michael said desperately. "Dad, you saved his life. Don't you think he'd want you to save your own?" As the sun set outside the hospital window, casting long shadows across the room, Robert Henderson sat surrounded by people who wanted to help him, facing the same impossible choice he'd confronted in a North Korean prison camp over 60 years ago. Expose himself to save his life, or maintain his dignity and accept the consequences. The difference was that this time the choice might cost him everything he'd spent a lifetime protecting, not just his life but his relationship with the son he'd raised and the community that respected him. The crisis that would test everything Michael thought he knew about medicine, family, and the price of survival began at 3:47 a.m. on a cold November morning when the heart monitor in Robert's room began screaming its electronic alarm. Michael jerked awake from the uncomfortable hospital chair where he'd been keeping vigil, instantly alert as his medical training kicked in. His father was convulsing on the bed, his back arched in what looked like excruciating pain, sweat pouring down his face as he gasped for breath. "Dad! Dad, can you hear me?" Michael lunged for the call button while simultaneously checking Robert's pulse. It was rapid and irregular, dangerous enough to send ice through Michael's veins. Dr. Willows burst through the door with two nurses, their faces grim with professional concern. "What happened? How long has he been like this?" Just started, Michael said, stepping back to let them work while every fiber of his being screamed at him to take control of the situation. Watching his father suffer while being relegated to the role of helpless family member was torture. His heart rate is at 180, one of the nurses reported, blood pressure dropping fast. I need to see his back, Dr. Willows said firmly, reaching for Robert's hospital gown. Now. Even in his semi-conscious state, Robert's body reacted violently to the attempt to expose his torso. His hands flew up defensively, and he began speaking rapidly in Korean, his voice filled with terror that transcended language barriers. Anya! Anya! Jebal! He gasped, the words torn from him in panic. Michael felt his heart breaking as he recognized the primal fear in his father's voice. He's saying no and please in Korean, he translated, his voice thick with emotion. He's begging them to stop. Doctor. Willows paused, her medical training warring with her compassion. Dr. Henderson, I need you to make a decision. We can sedate him and examine him without his consent. It might be the only way to save his life. But given his trauma history, the impossible choice crashed down on Michael like a physical weight. Force his father to endure the very violation he'd spent 60 years avoiding, or potentially watch him die from treatable injuries. Every ethical principle he'd learned in medical school seemed to crumble in the face of this moment. There has to be another way, Michael said desperately. Dad, please. You have to let us help you. But Robert was no longer in the hospital room. His eyes stared at something Michael couldn't see, and he was speaking in fragments of English and Korean, reliving some terrible memory from decades past. They said it wouldn't hurt, Robert whispered, his voice that of a much younger man. They lied. They always lied. The heart monitor continued its frantic beeping as Robert's condition deteriorated. His breathing became labored, and Michael could see the bluish tinge around his lips that indicated oxygen deprivation. Dr. Willows, we're losing him, the nurse said urgently. In that moment, Michael made the hardest decision of his life. Do it. Sedate him. Examine him. I'll take responsibility. As the sedative took effect and Robert's struggles gradually ceased, Michael felt like he was betraying everything his father had suffered to protect. But he was also a doctor, and he couldn't watch his father die from pride and trauma when medical intervention might save him. When Robert's hospital gown was finally lifted, the room fell into stunned silence. Michael had prepared himself for scars, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of what had been done to his father's body. The marks weren't random. They formed deliberate patterns across Robert's back and sides, geometric designs burned into flesh with methodical precision. Some were clearly electrical burns, others appeared to be cuts that had been allowed to heal poorly, creating raised, rope-like scars. It was the work of someone who understood how to inflict maximum psychological trauma alongside physical pain. Dear God, Dr. Willows whispered, and Michael heard one of the nurses stifle a sob, but it was what they found beneath the scars that truly shocked them. The X-rays revealed multiple pieces of shrapnel embedded throughout Robert's torso, some dangerously close to vital organs. One piece, no larger than a coin, had migrated over the decades and was now pressing against his heart. How has he been functioning with this much foreign material in his body? Dr. Willows asked in amazement. Michael stared at the X-ray images, understanding flooding through him. Because he's been in constant pain for 60 years and he's just lived with it. He's been slowly dying and we never knew. The largest piece of shrapnel had shifted recently, probably during his collapse at the Veterans Day ceremony, and was now causing the cardiac irregularities that threatened his life. Without immediate surgery, Robert would die within days. We need to operate, Dr. Willows said. Tonight, we can't wait for him to wake up and refuse treatment again. No. Michael's voice was firm despite the tears streaming down his face. When he wakes up, I tell him what we found. I tell him what he needs, and I let him decide. Dr. Henderson, with respect, your father isn't thinking clearly. The trauma, the pain. My father has been thinking more clearly than any of us, Michael interrupted. He knew this day would come. He knew that eventually someone would see what was done to him. And he chose to suffer in silence rather than expose himself to that violation again. 3 hours later, when Robert slowly emerged from sedation, Michael was sitting beside his bed with the X-ray images in his hands. His father's eyes focused gradually, and Michael saw the moment when awareness returned, along with the devastating realization that his deepest secret had been exposed. "You saw them," Robert said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. "Yes, Dad, we saw them." Robert closed his eyes, and Michael could see him gathering the strength to face this moment he'd dreaded for decades. "Now you know what kind of man raised you." "I know that the bravest man I've ever met raised me," Michael said firmly. "I know that you survived torture that would have broken most people. I know that you've been living with pain that would have sent me to my knees years ago. And now you know why I couldn't let you see. Why I couldn't let anyone see." Michael leaned forward, gripping his father's hand. "Dad, there's shrapnel in your chest. Old pieces, probably from when you were captured. One of them has moved and it's pressing against your heart. Without surgery, you'll die." Robert was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "How long do I have?" "Days, maybe a week. But, Dad, this is fixable. The surgery is risky, but you could have years left. Good years. Pain-free years." "Pain-free," Robert laughed bitterly. "Son, I haven't been pain-free since 1952. I don't even remember what that feels like." "Then let us remind you," Michael pleaded. "Let us give you that gift." Robert turned to look at his son, really look at him, for the first time since this nightmare began. "You're a good doctor, Michael. But you're an even better son than I deserved." "Dad, no, let me finish. I kept these secrets because I was ashamed. Not of what they did to me, but of what I became to survive it. The choices I made, the men I couldn't save. I didn't want you to know that your father was capable of the things survival required." Michael felt his world shift as he realized his father wasn't just talking about physical torture. There were moral wounds here too, psychological scars that ran deeper than any physical marking. "What are you saying, Dad?" Robert's eyes met his son's, and in them Michael saw a depth of pain that had nothing to do with shrapnel or electrical burns. "I'm saying that some secrets are too terrible to survive exposure, son. And I'm not sure I'm strong enough to live in a world where you know the truth about who your father really is." The revelation that would shatter everything Michael believed about his family, his identity, and his father's heroism came at 6:30 a.m. when Nurse Betty Sullivan entered the room carrying a manila envelope that looked like it had traveled through decades of bureaucratic offices. "Mr. Henderson," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made both men look up with apprehension. "I made some calls last night after what we discovered. My father served in Korea too, and he had contacts at the Veterans Administration. These documents arrived this morning." Robert's face went ashen as Betty placed the envelope on the bedside table. Michael could see his father's hands trembling as he stared at the official VA seal, and the reaction told him more than words ever could. "What's in there, Dad?" Michael asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "The truth," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible. "The whole truth." Betty hesitated at the door. "There's something else, Mr. Henderson, something I should have told you yesterday. My maiden name was Sullivan, But my father's name was James Park Sullivan. He served with you in the 7th Infantry Division." The name hit Robert like a physical blow. His eyes widened with recognition and something that looked like terror. "Jimmy Sullivan. Dear God, you're Jimmy's daughter." "He told me about you before he died," Betty continued, tears streaming down her face. "He said you saved his life more than once, but he also said there were things about the camp that haunted him until the day he died. Things he could never talk about, not even to family." Michael looked between them, feeling like he was watching a conversation in a foreign language. "What things? What happened in that camp that was so terrible you've all been keeping it secret for 60 years? Robert closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, Michael saw a different man. Not his father, but a broken soldier carrying guilt that had festered for decades. "Open the envelope," Robert said quietly. "But before you read what's in there, I need you to know something. Everything I'm about to tell you will change how you see me. It might change how you see yourself." With shaking hands, Michael opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of documents. The first page was a declassified military report dated April 15, 1954, titled "Debriefing Report, Sergeant Robert Henderson, Repatriated POW." As he read, Michael felt the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his father begin to crumble. "During his 18-month captivity," Michael read aloud, "Sergeant Henderson was subjected to intensive interrogation and coercion techniques designed to extract intelligence about American troop movements and strategic positions. Subject demonstrated remarkable resistance to standard torture methods, leading interrogators to employ increasingly severe psychological pressure." Michael's voice trailed off as he reached a section that made his blood run cold. "Subject was forced to make impossible choices regarding the welfare of fellow prisoners. Interrogators would select 2 prisoners and inform Henderson that he must choose which one would receive medical attention and which would be denied treatment. Failure to choose would result in both prisoners being denied care." The room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of Robert's heart monitor. Michael looked up at his father, seeing the ancient pain etched in every line of his weathered face. "They made you choose who lived and who died," Michael said, his voice thick with horror and understanding. 17 times, Robert whispered. 17 times they made me point at one man and condemn another to death, and every time I chose, because I knew that if I didn't choose, they'd both die, and my choice would save at least one life." Michael continued reading, his hands shaking as the full scope of his father's ordeal became clear. The psychological torture had been systematic and deliberate, designed not just to break prisoners, but to destroy their sense of moral identity. Robert had been singled out as a leader among the prisoners, making him a primary target for the most sophisticated forms of psychological warfare. "But there's more, isn't there?" Michael asked, seeing additional pages in the envelope. "This isn't everything." Betty stepped forward, her face grave. "Dr. Henderson, the last document. It's about you." Michael pulled out a birth certificate written in Korean, with an official translation attached. As he read, the world seemed to tilt around him. The document identified him as Lee Myung-ho, born in Seoul on March 15, 1972, to unknown parents. Attached was an American adoption certificate dated September 3, 1972, showing that Robert and Martha Henderson had adopted a 6-month-old Korean infant through a military adoption program. "I'm not your biological son," Michael said, the words feeling strange and hollow as they left his mouth. "No," Robert said quietly, "but you've been my son in every way that matters since the day we brought you home." "How? How did you find me? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Robert's voice was barely a whisper as he began the hardest story of his life. "When I was in the camp, there was a young woman, a nurse who treated the wounded prisoners. She was kind, gentle, tried to help us when she could. The guards, they didn't like her compassion. They made an example of her. Michael felt sick as he realized where this story was heading. She was pregnant, Robert continued, tears streaming down his face. About 7 months along. They hurt her badly as punishment for helping us. She died giving birth, but the baby survived. A little boy with her eyes and her gentle spirit. Me, Michael whispered. One of the guards was going to dispose of the child. I couldn't let that happen. I made a deal. I told them I'd cooperate with their interrogations, give them some intelligence about troop movements, outdated information that wouldn't hurt anyone but would seem valuable to them. In exchange, they'd let me arrange for the baby to be sent to an orphanage in Seoul. The room was spinning around Michael as he processed this revelation. His entire identity, everything he thought he knew about himself, had been built on a foundation of secrets and sacrifice. But how did I end up with you and Martha? When I was repatriated, I couldn't stop thinking about that little boy. I'd made 17 choices that condemned men to death, but I'd made one choice that saved a life. I had to know what happened to you. Robert's voice grew stronger as he spoke. I used every connection I had, called in every favor, worked with adoption agencies and military contacts. It took months, but I found you in that Seoul orphanage. Michael stared at the documents in his hands, understanding flooding through him. You adopted me not just to give me a family, but because you needed to save someone after being forced to let so many die. Maybe that's how it started, Robert admitted. But the moment Martha and I held you, you became our son, not our project, not our way of healing, our child. Everything we did after that, every choice we made was about giving you the best life possible. Betty spoke up softly. Dr. Henderson, there's one more thing. Your biological mother, the nurse who died giving birth to you, her name was Lee Soon-ja. According to the records, she was known in the camp for her courage and compassion. She died protecting the very men your father was forced to choose between. The irony was overwhelming. Michael, the son of a woman who died helping prisoners of war, had been raised by a man who'd been forced to choose which prisoners lived or died. His entire life had been shaped by the intersection of courage and impossible choices, sacrifice and survival. Why didn't you ever tell me? Michael asked, his voice breaking. All these years, why keep it secret? Because I wanted you to grow up proud of who you were, not burdened by the circumstances of how you came to us, Robert said. Because I was afraid that if you knew the truth about me, about the choices I made, the men who died because of my decisions, you'd see me as a monster instead of a father. Michael looked at this man who had raised him, loved him, sacrificed everything for him, and felt a love so profound it threatened to overwhelm him completely. Dad, he said firmly, you're not a monster. You're the man who saved my life before you even knew me. You're the man who turned the worst experience of your life into something beautiful by giving me a family. You're my hero. But even as he spoke these words, Michael could see that his father was still drowning in 60 years of unresolved guilt and trauma. The revelation of these secrets hadn't freed Robert. It had opened wounds that had never properly healed, and time was running out. The healing began with the most unlikely catalyst, a phone call that would transform tragedy into triumph and bring the Henderson family full circle in ways they never could have imagined. It was Mr. Park who made the call that changed everything. He had spent the night translating the Korean documents Betty had brought, and what he discovered sent him rushing back to the hospital with tears streaming down his weathered face. Henderson, SSI, he said, bursting into the room where Michael sat vigil beside his father's bed. Your son is the baby from the camp. Robert looked up weakly, his condition having deteriorated overnight as the shrapnel pressed closer to his heart. I know, old friend. I told him everything. No, you don't understand, Mr. Park said urgently, pulling out a faded photograph from his wallet. Look at this. This is Soonja, the nurse who helped us. Look at her face, then look at your son. Michael took the photograph with trembling hands. The woman in the picture was young, perhaps 25, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed familiar. But it was when he looked closer that the resemblance hit him like a physical blow. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, even the way she held her head. He was looking at his biological mother for the first time. She was beautiful, Michael whispered, touching the worn edges of the photograph. She was an angel, Mr. Park said, his voice thick with emotion. When the guards would beat us, she would sneak medicine to our cells. When we were starving, she would share her own food. When we lost hope, she would tell us stories about her dreams of peace, of a world where children could grow up safe and loved. Robert struggled to sit up straighter, his eyes fixed on the photograph. She talked about wanting to be a mother someday. Said she would adopt orphaned children if she couldn't have her own. She never got to see you born, son, but I think she would be proud of the man you became. The moment was interrupted by Dr. Willows, who entered with a gravity that silenced the room. Mr. Henderson, I need to speak with you and your son immediately. The shrapnel has shifted again. We have perhaps 6 hours before it causes irreversible damage to your heart. Robert nodded with surprising calm. Then it's time to make a choice. Dad, please, Michael pleaded. Let them operate. Let us save you. Michael, I've been running from this moment for 60 years. Every day I've lived has been borrowed time, time I took from the men who didn't make it home. Robert's voice grew stronger as he spoke. Maybe it's time to stop running. No! The shout came from an unexpected source. Nurse Betty Sullivan, who had been quietly listening from the doorway. Mr. Henderson, with all due respect, you don't get to make that choice anymore. She strode into the room with determination that surprised everyone. My father, Jimmy Sullivan, spent his whole life telling me about the man who saved him in that camp. Do you know what he said about you? He said you were the reason he lived to come home, to marry my mother, to have children and grandchildren. Betty pulled out her phone and showed them a photograph, a large family gathering with dozens of people spanning multiple generations. This is my family, Mr. Henderson. 3 generations of Sullivans who exist because you chose to save my father's life in that prison camp. 43 people who are alive today because of a choice you made 60 years ago. Robert stared at the photograph, his eyes wide with shock. And that's not all, Betty continued. I made more calls last night. Do you remember Private Chen, Tommy Williams, David Rodriguez? All the men you saved in that camp? Some of them, Robert whispered. They all made it home. They all had families. Tommy Williams became a teacher. He educated over 1,000 children during his career. David Rodriguez became a firefighter. He saved dozens of lives. Private Chen opened a restaurant and employed half the veterans in his neighborhood. Betty's voice grew stronger with each name. The ripple effects of your choices, Mr. Henderson, the good choices, the life-saving choices, they've spread through generations. You didn't just save 17 men in that camp. You saved their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. Michael felt his heart swelling with pride and understanding. Dad, you've been carrying the guilt of the men who died, but what about the legacy of the men who lived? Robert was crying now, 60 years of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. But the others, the ones I couldn't choose, were dying anyway, Mr. Park said gently. Remember, old friend, the guards would let both die if you didn't choose. Your choices didn't kill anyone. Your choices saved lives. Dr. Willows cleared her throat. Mr. Henderson, I don't mean to interrupt this moment, but we really do need a decision about the surgery. Robert looked around the room at the faces surrounding him. His son, his old friend from the camp, the daughter of a man he'd saved, the doctor who wanted to heal him. For the first time in 60 years, he saw hope instead of judgment, love instead of condemnation. "If I have this surgery," he said slowly, "and if I survive it, what kind of life would I have?" "A normal one," Dr. Willows said. "The pain you've been living with would be gone. You could travel, spend time with family, maybe even help other veterans who are struggling with similar trauma." "Other veterans," Robert repeated thoughtfully. Michael leaned forward. "Dad, think about it. How many other Korean War veterans are out there suffering in silence like you were? How many are carrying guilt and trauma that could be healed if they just knew they weren't alone? You could tell your story," Betty added. "Help people understand what POWs went through, advocate for better mental health care for veterans." Mr. Park nodded enthusiastically. "Many of us from the camp, we still meet once a year. We are old now, but we remember. We remember the man who gave us hope when we had none." Robert was quiet for a long moment, and Michael could see him wrestling with a lifetime of self-imposed isolation and guilt. Finally, he looked up at his son with clear, determined eyes. "Michael, if I do this surgery, will you stay? Will you help me figure out how to live with these memories in a way that honors the dead instead of hiding from them?" "Dad, I'll do more than that," Michael said, gripping his father's hand. "I'll move back home. I'll open a practice here in Millbrook. We'll face this together, the way we should have been doing all along." "And I'll help too," Betty said. "The hospital has been wanting to start a veterans support program. Who better to lead it than someone who's been where they've been?" Robert looked around the room one more time, then nodded slowly. "All right. Let's do the surgery. Let's see if this old soldier has any fight left in him." As the medical team prepared Robert for surgery, Michael pulled his father aside for a private moment. "Dad, I need you to know something. Learning about my biological mother, about how I came to be your son, it doesn't change anything. You and Martha are my parents. You're the ones who raised me, loved me, made me who I am." Robert's eyes filled with tears. "Son, you've given me the greatest gift a father could ask for. You've shown me that love isn't about blood. It's about choice. And every day for 52 years I've chosen to be your father, just like you've chosen to be my son." As they wheeled Robert toward the operating room, he called out one last thing to Michael. "Take care of that photograph of your mother. She deserves to be remembered too." Michael clutched the picture of Sunja, understanding finally that his story wasn't just about one father's love, but about a chain of sacrifices and choices that had shaped his entire existence. His biological mother had died protecting prisoners of war. His adoptive father had endured torture to save lives. And now it was his turn to carry that legacy forward. The surgery would take 6 hours. The healing would take a lifetime. But for the first time in 60 years, Robert Henderson was ready to live instead of just survive. The operating room at Millbrook General had never seen a surgery quite like this one. Dr. Patricia Willows had called in a specialist from Cleveland, and together they worked for 6 grueling hours to remove decades-old shrapnel from Robert Henderson's chest while his son paced the waiting room with the nervous energy of someone whose entire world hung in the balance. Michael had called his practice in Chicago to arrange an extended leave of absence, knowing that regardless of the surgery's outcome, his life had fundamentally changed. He couldn't go back to being the distant, successful son who visited on holidays. Not after learning the truth about his father's sacrifice, his own origins, and the web of love and loss that had shaped their family. Nurse Betty Sullivan had stationed herself in the waiting room like a guardian angel, updating the growing crowd of townspeople who had gathered when word spread about Robert's surgery. Mrs. Peterson from next door sat knitting in the corner, her needles clicking a steady rhythm of hope. Pastor Williams led a small prayer circle, while Mayor Collins fielded calls from local news stations who had somehow gotten wind of the story. But it was Mr. Park who provided the most comfort to Michael during those endless hours. The elderly Korean man shared story after story about Robert's heroism in the prison camp, painting a picture of a young soldier who had faced impossible choices with courage and compassion. "Your father," Mr. Park said during hour 4 of the surgery, "he was like a candle in the darkness. When we thought we would die in that place, when we lost all hope, he would remind us of home. He would tell us about the life he wanted to build, the family he wanted to have. He spoke of adopting children who needed love, of creating a home filled with peace and happiness." Michael felt tears streaming down his face as he realized that his father's dreams from the prison camp had become reality. Robert had indeed created a home filled with love, had adopted a child who needed a family, had built exactly the life he'd dreamed of during his darkest moments. When Dr. Willows finally emerged from the operating room, her surgical mask pulled down to reveal an exhausted but triumphant smile, the entire waiting room held its breath. "The surgery was successful," she announced, and the room erupted in cheers and sobs of relief. "We removed 3 pieces of shrapnel, including the one that was pressing against his heart. It was touch and go for a while. The scar tissue had grown around the fragments, making extraction extremely delicate. But your father is stronger than we imagined." Michael felt his knees go weak with relief. "Can I see him?" "He's in recovery now, still sedated but stable. The next 24 hours will be critical. But Dr. Henderson, I have to say, I've never seen anyone survive what your father has endured." The fact that he's lived a normal life for 60 years with that much foreign material in his body is nothing short of miraculous. As Michael was led to the recovery room, he marveled at how different his father looked without the tension of chronic pain etched in his features. Even unconscious, Robert appeared more peaceful than Michael had ever seen him. The next few days passed in a blur of medical consultations, family conversations, and emotional breakthroughs that 6 decades in the making. When Robert finally woke up fully alert and pain-free for the first time since 1952, his reaction was one of wonder and disbelief. "I can breathe," he whispered to Michael, his voice filled with amazement. "Son, I can actually breathe without pain." "How does it feel, Dad?" Robert was quiet for a moment, exploring the absence of pain that had been his constant companion for so long. "Like being reborn," he said finally. Like getting a second chance at life. That second chance began to take shape more quickly than anyone had anticipated. News of Robert's story had spread beyond Millbrook, picked up by regional newspapers and eventually national media outlets. The narrative of a Korean War POW who had suffered in silence for 60 years while raising an adopted son struck a chord with Americans across the country. Within a week of Robert's surgery, the hospital had received over 5,000 letters from veterans and their families sharing their own stories of hidden trauma and untreated wounds. The Veterans Administration called to discuss Robert's case and its implications for other Korean War veterans who might be suffering from similar untreated injuries. "Dad," Michael said one afternoon as they sat together in the hospital room reading through the flood of supportive mail, "people want to hear your story. They want to know how you survived, how you healed, how you built a beautiful life despite everything you endured." Robert held up a letter from a Vietnam veteran in Texas who had been living with untreated PTSD for 50 years. "This man says he's going to seek help for the first time because of our story. How is that possible?" Because hope is contagious, Michael replied. Because when people see that healing is possible, even after decades of suffering, it gives them permission to hope for their own healing. The transformation in Robert over the following weeks was remarkable. Without the constant physical pain that had been his companion for 60 years, he began to open up emotionally in ways that amazed everyone who knew him. He started talking about his experiences in the prison camp, not with the shame and guilt that had characterized his silence, but with the wisdom of someone who had survived the unsurvivable. Betty Sullivan approached him with the hospital's Veteran Support Program proposal, and Robert surprised everyone by agreeing to lead it. If my story can help one person avoid the isolation I chose, then maybe those 60 years of silence served a purpose after all. The program began with a simple meeting in the hospital's community room. Robert, Mr. Park, and 3 other local veterans sharing coffee and conversation. Word spread quickly through the veteran community, and within a month they were hosting weekly sessions for dozens of participants. Michael watched his father's transformation with wonder and pride. The man who had spent 6 decades hiding his wounds was now helping others expose and heal theirs. Robert's Wednesdays were no longer solitary trips to visit graves. They were filled with group therapy sessions, one-on-one counseling, and advocacy work for veteran mental health services. But perhaps the most profound change came in the relationship between father and son. For the first time in their lives, they could talk openly about their fears, their love for each other, and their hopes for the future. Michael learned about Martha's dreams for their family, about Robert's pride in his son's medical career, about the daily struggle to balance protection and love in raising a child while carrying such heavy secrets. "You know what the hardest part was?" Robert said one evening as they watched the sunset from his hospital room window. "It wasn't the physical pain or even the memories of the camp. It was knowing that I had this incredible gift, you, and being afraid that if you knew the truth about how you came to be my son, you might not love me anymore. Dad, learning the truth made me love you more, not less. Understanding the sacrifice you made, the courage it took to save me, to raise me, to build a life despite everything you'd endured, it makes me proud to be your son." Robert smiled, and Michael realized it was the first genuinely happy expression he'd ever seen on his father's face. "Son, I've spent 60 years trying to be worthy of the life I was given. Maybe it's time to start enjoying it instead." As Robert's recovery progressed and his discharge date approached, Michael made good on his promise to relocate his practice to Millbrook. The small town embraced its returning son with open arms, especially when they learned he planned to specialize in veteran health services alongside his cardiology practice. The house on Maple Street, which had been frozen in time since Martha's death, slowly came back to life. Father and son worked together to sort through Martha's belongings, sharing memories and creating new traditions. They kept her romance novels on the shelves, but added medical journals and veteran advocacy materials alongside them. The morning Robert was finally discharged from the hospital, the entire town turned out to welcome him home. Mayor Collins had organized a small ceremony, but what touched Robert most was seeing Mr. Park standing beside the Korean War Memorial, holding the American flag that Robert had been raising when he collapsed weeks earlier. "Ready to finish what we started?" Mr. Park asked with a smile. Together, the 2 old soldiers raised the flag while the town watched in respectful silence. But this time, when Robert grasped the rope, his hands were steady, his breathing was easy, and his heart was finally free from the weight of decades-old shrapnel and guilt. As the flag reached the top of the pole and unfurled in the crisp November breeze, Michael stood beside his father with tears of joy streaming down his face. This was more than a flag ceremony. It was a celebration of survival, healing, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest chapters of human experience. The Henderson family's story of pain and healing had come full circle, but their new chapter of hope and service was just beginning. For our readers who followed Robert and Michael's journey, this story reminds us that it's never too late for healing, never too late to seek help, and never too late to build deeper connections with the people we love. Many of us carry our own hidden wounds, whether from military service, family trauma, or life's unexpected challenges. But Robert's courage in finally accepting help shows us that vulnerability can be strength, and that sharing our struggles often lightens the load for ourselves and others. The bonds between generations grow stronger when we choose honesty over protection, when we trust our loved ones with our authentic selves rather than the versions we think they want to see. What hidden struggles have you been carrying that might benefit from sharing with someone you trust? Have you ever discovered something about a family member that completely changed how you understood their life and choices? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.